Well, g'day and welcome to the Sermon Podcast for Northern Illawarra Uniting Church. We are Bullai's chapel on a hill, and whether you're here in Bullai or listening from somewhere else around the world, we're glad you're with us. Our mission is to make way for all people to come home to God, and that includes you. Friends, happy Easter. It is April 20th, Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. Our reading for today is a little bit unusual, not from one of the Gospels, but from one of the first sermons preached in the early church about the Easter message, and it's found in Acts chapter 10, verse 36. This is Peter speaking as he visits with the centurion Cornelius at his invitation. Peter says, "You know the message he sent to the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. That message spread throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John announced. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. How he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. We are witnesses to all that he did, both in Judea and Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him on the third day and allowed him to appear, not to all people, but to us who were chosen by God as witnesses, and who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him and receives forgiveness through his name." And while Peter was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. The word of the Lord. Well, look, it's very tempting to go big on Easter Sunday, to put on the fancy shirt, the big hat. Kids want the big Easter basket. Churches, in my experience, reach for the horns and the choirs, big music. Preachers tend to want to go extra long in the sermon. If you're hosting a family brunch, you want the preacher to go short, but you definitely want to go big on the barbecue and the drinks and the lunch table at the lunch you're hosting after service. We want to go big on Easter Sunday because it's a big deal. All the words of the great hymns that we sing are true. Christ the Lord is risen today. Love's redeeming work is done. Alleluia, Christ is risen. Death at last has met defeat. See the ancient powers of evil in confusion and retreat. He is Lord. He has risen from the dead, and he is Lord. It is a big deal. But on that first Easter Sunday itself, and in those early few years of the church, on Easter, nobody went big. Easter Sunday, as you probably know, the first morning of Resurrection Day, was just 3 women in the pre-dawn light, dark and huddled and afraid. The disciples themselves, even after meeting the risen Christ, were still unsure of what all of this meant. And besides, none of them were a big deal themselves. Unemployed fishermen, tax collectors, unemployed prostitutes. The person they were following had just been executed. They had no idea. They had nothing in the world. They certainly didn't hire out a marching band and a choir. They didn't rent out a blimp to share the good news. They did not, as far as we know, go to the shopping centre and hand out Easter eggs to children while parents took photos. I don't think the idea even occurred to them. But even more to the point, they didn't strap on swords and raise up an army to quote-unquote persuade people. The early disciples had none of that. No big strategy, no big response. They simply had one thing. And it was the simple truth that Jesus, so brutally executed by the great powers of their world, had come to life again, and they had met him and touched him and eaten with him. So in small, fitful ways, they started to share this simple but life-altering, world-changing truth. A truth so strange and weighty that it didn't always make sense to them. So they shared a message here and a conversation there, whispering almost in the shadows of the empire that something remarkable had happened. You know how it is. When you feel and know something so deeply, you're almost shy about it. But over time, they found their voice. They hadn't come up with the great hymns or the great Easter jokes. It was just the simple truth. Jesus is risen. Jesus is Lord. And so that's why today we read not from the great moving resurrection stories or the liturgies found in Paul's epistles. I wanted to read today from one of those first shy, awkward conversations about the resurrection that Peter had, this time with a man named Cornelius. Cornelius had invited him to speak in his living room. He was a Roman soldier, no religious bigwig, but he wanted to know about Jesus. He had had a vision. You can read about the rest of it in Acts chapter 10. And so he sends for Peter, and Peter comes, and he asks Peter, and Peter tells him. And today in the message that we read, the sermon, I just wanted to point out two interesting things, and then we'll be done. Firstly, I want to point out what Peter said. And secondly, I want to point out where he said it. The first thing is that Peter talks about the resurrection. He talks about Jesus as though he was a real person and the resurrection really happened. There's no great emotional hype or complex philosophical wrangling or poetic language. In fact, the language is so mundane. Jesus was anointed by God, filled with the Spirit, says Peter, and he went around doing good and healing people. I just love that line. Jesus went around doing good and healing people. There is a lot of baggage around religion and Christianity. 2,000 years, so much has been added. But Peter doesn't know any of that yet. All he knows is the man he knew was filled with God's Spirit and went around doing good and healing people. I don't know. What else would you want God to do when he showed up? And then Peter says they crucified him. The agents of state religion and state authority put him to death by hanging him on a cross. But God raised him. And then Jesus met back up with his friends and ate and drank with them. Listen, every year I waste my time racking my brain to figure out how to make the Easter message more interesting, more magnificent, more unique, more compelling. And every year I stare off from my computer screen and smack myself wondering what I'm trying to do. All that matters is this. The resurrection is true. Jesus was dead and rose again. That's what Peter is doing. He's telling us, not convincing us, not selling us. He's simply telling us that it happened and that this Jesus is now the judge, a crucified criminal, this man filled with the Spirit of God who went around doing good. He, Jesus, has the final say in the affairs of the world. Who else would we want it to be? What better way to fix the world? The only question is whether it's true. We know it's good news. Is it true news? And Peter says it is. With no sword, no marketing budget, no blimp, millions, billions around the world throughout history have found him to be telling the truth. Jesus Christ is alive. So that's the what of the message. But the where also matters. Because Peter is not in a pulpit or in a cathedral. Peter shares this message of life-altering, world-changing news in the living room of a Roman centurion. Even Peter himself couldn't believe he was there. And so Peter spends the first half of the sermon just talking about everything that had happened, not some distant place, not in a galaxy far, far away. It happened just a few miles away in a specific time, in a specific place. There's not a cosmic truth or an ideology. What Peter is talking about is a person, an event, and now it's being passed on from a Jewish fisherman to a Roman centurion. These are very specific people, places, and they're talking about a very specific event. That matters. It's not humanity in general or philosophers who need to hear the good news of the resurrection. It's me. And it's you. If you hear anything today in the Easter message, I want you to know that the message is for you, where you live, in your living room. What God does through Christ is for you, and you are called to trust in that message and that alone. It's not a truth that lives in church or in books. It's for your family, for you, in your living room. There was a well-known preacher who I loved. He passed away last year, actually. His name's Tony Campolo. And I once heard him tell a story. He was a gifted storyteller. And he's told the story that always stuck with me, even the intonation in his voice. Tony was a well-known speaker in Pennsylvania, and he was invited to speak at a church one time. And before the church, the service, 8 leaders knelt with him so they could lay their hands on his head and pray for him. It was one of those prayers, maybe if you've been in churches before, one of those prayers that went on for a long time. And he could feel his knees going numb, but the prayer just kept going and going. Especially because one leader had just gotten to praying not for Tony and the talk and the service that was about to happen, but for another issue entirely. He started praying for a church neighbor. And the way Tony tells the story, it's really funny. He says, "Dear Lord, you know Charlie Stoltzfus. He lives in that silver trailer down the road a mile. You know the trailer, Lord, just down the road on the right-hand side. And Tony, whose knees were hurting and palms were sweating, just wanted to interrupt and tell the man that God already knew where the guy lived and didn't need directions, but the prayer went on. Lord, Charlie told me something this morning. He told me he's going to leave his wife and 3 kids. Lord, would you step in and do something, God? Bring that family back together. And one more time for good measure, he said, and you know, Lord, Charlie Stoltzfus in the silver trailer down the road on the right-hand side. With that, the prayer time ended and Tony went on to preach at the church service. Things went well and he got in his car and began to drive home. And as he was driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, a big road there where he was, he saw a hitchhiker and felt compelled to pick him up. And as they drove for a few minutes, he leaned over and said, "Hi, my name's Tony Campolo. What's yours?" And you know, the man turned to him and said, "My name is Charlie Stoltzfus." And Tony slammed on the brakes, did a U-turn, and headed back. Of course, Charlie got nervous. "Where are you taking me?" he said. Tony looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'm taking you home." Charlie asked, "Why?" He said, "Because you just left your wife and 3 kids." And he drove right to the silver trailer just down the road on the right-hand side. And Charlie asked, "How did you know that I live here?" And Tony said, and quite rightly too, "God told me." Then he opened the trailer door and his wife explained, "You're back, you're back." And Charlie went up to her and whispered in her ear, and the more he talked, the bigger her eyes got. And Tony said with real authority he had, "The 2 of you sit down. God has something to tell you." Friends, that's where the Easter message shows up. It's where God shows up in Galilee, in Judea, in Cornelius's living room, in a silver trailer on the right-hand side of the road, in your house. We don't need the message in general. We don't need healing in general. We don't need the idea of healing. We don't need the idea of resurrection. When you call an ambulance, you don't say, "Oh, you know, I live around the place." You give a very specific address and you say, "This is what I need." That's what we say to Jesus. "Jesus, here's where I live. Here's what I need." Easter Sunday is a big deal. But it's also the smallest deal imaginable. Because it fits in your life. It's right there for you and for me to receive and believe and build our lives on. The Easter message has come. I don't know what it will look like when it ends. No eye has seen, nor ear has heard what God has prepared for those that love him. The hymns we sing today give us a glimpse. But we do know what the gospel looks like when it begins. Because it begins here. Not in the halls of power, but here in your living room. The living resurrection power of Jesus is for you today.